He had built an empire on fear, controlled half of New York's underground with nothing but a cold stare and a reputation soaked in blood. And yet the most powerful man in the city was standing in the rain outside a modest house in Queens, holding divorce papers he could no longer bring himself to deliver. Adrian Voss had survived assassination attempts, federal investigations, and betrayals that would have broken lesser men. But nothing had ever gutted him the way his wife's silence had. He thought he had lost her. He was about to discover he had almost destroyed her. If you've ever loved someone so much that your fear became a weapon against them, this story is for you. Subscribe to the channel and follow every episode to the end, because this is the kind of story that doesn't let go. Hit like and drop a comment telling me your city or country. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The envelope had been sitting on Adrian Voss's desk for 11 days. He knew the exact number because he had counted them the way a man counts the days after a wound stops bleeding but hasn't closed, aware of everyone, not proud of keeping track. The envelope was cream-colored, thick, sealed with the kind of quiet authority that only legal documents carry. Inside it were 32 pages. He hadn't needed to read them more than once. His attorney had prepared them efficiently, without sentiment, the way Adrian had always preferred things done. 32 pages to end 12 years. The office smelled like bourbon and old leather and the faint chemical bite of the imported cigars he'd stopped smoking 2 years ago because Elena had asked him to. The humidor still sat on the corner of the desk, full. He hadn't touched it. Some habits die the way people do, all at once, and then you spend years not knowing what to do with what's left behind. It was past midnight when Marco knocked. "You called for me?" Marco Fenn was Adrian's longest-standing lieutenant, 31 years old, built like a man who'd grown up moving furniture and then graduated to moving things that couldn't be discussed in polite company. He had a scar that started below his left ear and traveled south toward his collar, and he never explained it, and nobody ever asked. He stood in the doorway with his hands at his sides and his eyes doing that careful thing they always did, reading the room before reading the man in it. "Close the door." Marco stepped in and closed it behind him without sound. Adrian didn't look up from the desk. He was staring at the envelope the way you stare at something you've already decided about, but can't quite make yourself execute. "The Delano shipment," he said. "Who authorized the reroute through Hoboken?" Castilla's people flagged the original route. Wanted a show of good faith. "That wasn't their call." "No, it wasn't. Fix it." "It's already fixed." A pause stretched between them, the kind that had weight to it. Marco didn't fill silences unnecessarily. It was one of the reasons Adrian kept him close. "Is there something else?" Marco said finally. Adrian picked up the envelope, turned it over once, set it back down. "No." Marco nodded and left. The house was enormous and almost entirely quiet. 43 rooms across 4 floors of a limestone mansion in a gated neighborhood just north of the city. The kind of address that didn't show up in public records because enough money applied in the right places ensured that certain facts remained private. There were 8 men on the grounds tonight. Adrian rotated security teams on a schedule that nobody outside the organization knew, and not one of them would come inside unless he called. He was, by every visible measure, completely protected. He had never felt more exposed in his life. He poured 2 fingers of bourbon, stood at the window and looked out at the grounds. The iron fence, the manicured grass gone silver gray in the security lights, the bare-armed oak trees at the property's edge. It was February, the kind of cold that didn't announce itself dramatically, but simply settled in and stayed, like bad news. Elena had been to her mother's house again this past weekend, 3rd time in 6 weeks. He hadn't asked her about it when she came home Sunday night. She'd come in quietly, moved through the kitchen, poured herself a glass of water, and gone upstairs without once looking for him. Not with anger, not with cold deliberateness, just absent. Like a woman moving through a space she no longer considered her own. He'd been sitting right there in the living room, and she had passed not 12 feet from him, and the distance between them might as well have been a continent. He'd watched her go. He hadn't said a word. That was the thing about Adrian Voss that none of his enemies would have believed, if anyone had been foolish enough to tell them. He was ruthless in every room except the ones he shared with her. With Elena, he had always been not soft exactly, but something close to it, something he had no word for that didn't embarrass him. He finished the bourbon and set the glass down too hard, and it made a sharp sound in the quiet room that felt like a verdict. He had met her at a fundraiser 12 years ago, the kind of charity event that powerful men attended to demonstrate that they had cultural interests beyond the ones that couldn't be named in newspapers. Elena Marquez had not known who he was. That alone had been extraordinary. She'd been standing near the bar with a glass of wine she wasn't drinking, wearing a dark blue dress, reading the program for the exhibition with the focused attention of someone who actually cared about what was written in it. She was not there to be seen, she was just there, present in herself in a way that Adrian, who spent most of his life surrounded by people performing carefully for him, found almost disorienting. He'd introduced himself with his actual name and none of his titles, and she'd said her own name and asked him what he thought of the sculptor being featured, and he'd admitted he didn't know the sculptor's work, and she'd laughed, not politely, but genuinely, a short surprise sound, and said, "Then why did you come?" He'd said, "I wasn't sure until just now." It was the most honest thing he'd said to another person in years. They had been married 8 months after that night. Not because anyone pushed them toward it, and not because it made strategic sense. It made no strategic sense at all. A man in his position acquiring someone to care about was nothing but a liability, and he knew it. But because Elena was the first person in Adrian's adult life who looked directly at him and did not calculate what she saw. She wasn't measuring his power or his money or his danger. She was just looking at him, at the man. And whatever she found there, she had stayed. For almost 12 years, she had stayed. Ballpunkt. The first sign that something had changed came in March of the previous year. He wouldn't have marked it as significant if he were being honest, not at first. Elena had always had an independent quality to her, a self-containment he respected. She didn't need to be in the same room with him to feel connected to him, and that had always suited them both. So when she began spending more evenings alone, reading in the study rather than watching television with him in the living room, taking walks in the evening she used to spend at dinner with him, he noticed it without immediately naming it. Then she stopped asking about his work. That was the thing that landed differently. Elena had never asked for details. She wasn't naive. She knew what he was, had always known, and she had made her choice about that with open eyes. But she used to ask about the people, about Marco's family, about whether the situation with the Delano distribution was resolved. Small questions that meant, "I see that you carry weight. I see that the weight is real." She'd never pretended his world didn't exist. That pretense had always felt to Adrian more dangerous than acknowledgement. But in March, the questions stopped. He noticed. He said nothing. Then came April, and the phone calls she began taking in another room. Not furtively, she wasn't hiding exactly, but privately, in a way she hadn't before. He once walked past the hallway and heard her speaking in a low voice, heard the tension in it, and something in his chest tightened the way it did right before a situation turned dangerous. He did not listen. He wanted to. He was a man who gathered intelligence for a living, who considered surveillance a basic operating principle, who had dismantled organizations by listening carefully to the things people said when they thought no one was paying attention. But listening to Elena felt like a line he could not cross. He had never violated her privacy, and he wasn't going to start because he was afraid. He told himself that. He told himself that several times over several weeks. May came. She missed dinner twice in 1 week without explanation. She apologized the next morning in the brief, efficient way of someone who doesn't have the emotional space to make the apology larger. And Adrian had said, "It's fine," because he didn't know what else to say. He was fluent in the language of threat and negotiation and the careful diplomacy of men who keep guns in their desk drawers. He did not know how to say, "Something is wrong with us, and I don't know how to name it, and that scares me more than anything has scared me in years." He was not built for that conversation. He was not sure he'd ever been. By June, he had started watching her the way he watched everything else, systematically, quietly, accumulating observations and arranging them into patterns. She looked tired in a way that sleep didn't seem to fix. She'd lost a little weight. Sometimes he'd come into a room and she'd look up with something in her expression. Not guilt, not quite, but something careful. Something like a door being deliberately not opened. He did not know what to do with any of it. A man in his position had very specific responses available to him when he believed someone was moving against his interests. None of those responses applied here. He couldn't send men to surveil his own wife. He couldn't apply pressure to someone he refused to harm. He was entirely without his usual arsenal, and the unfamiliarity of that helplessness made him angry, and his anger, because it had nowhere to go, turned inward and calcified into something colder. He began to believe she no longer wanted to be here. Once he began believing it, he couldn't stop. September was when the distance became something he could no longer rationalize away. They sat at dinner on a Wednesday evening. The housekeeper had prepared the lamb dish that had always been Elena's favorite, and she ate without tasting it. He could tell by the mechanical way her fork moved, the absent rhythm of it. He watched her across the table and tried to find the right entry point into whatever conversation needed to happen, and couldn't locate one. The silence between them had acquired texture by then. It wasn't comfortable silence. It was the silence of two people orbiting the same unspoken thing from opposite directions. "How was your day?" he said. "Fine." A pause. "Yours?" "Productive." That was all. 12 years of marriage reduced to 4 words and the sound of silverware. He thought about reaching across the table. The distance was not physical, maybe 3 feet of linen tablecloth between them. But his hand didn't move. Pride, maybe. Or fear disguised as pride, which was the same disease with a better-looking name. She went upstairs early that night. He sat at the table for a long time after she left, looking at the lamb she hadn't finished. October brought the first weekend at her mother's house. Rosa Marquez lived in Queens in the narrow 2-story house she'd occupied for 30 years, a woman Adrian had always respected for her directness and privately suspected of not trusting him, though she'd been consistently civil. Elena called to say she'd be spending Saturday night there, something about helping her mother with some repairs that had been put off. Adrian said of course and meant it. There was nothing unusual in the request. Rosa was getting older. Elena was devoted to her. But then she went back 2 weeks later, and again the following month. He had a man in Queens, not watching Rosa's house, nothing that deliberate, but an arrangement that meant if anything notable occurred in that neighborhood, he'd hear about it. There was nothing notable to hear. Elena arrived, spent the night, left Sunday afternoon. No unusual visitors, no unusual activity, which told him nothing except that whatever was happening had nothing to do with security. November passed in a kind of gray suspension. He threw himself into work with the focused intensity he'd learned to use as insulation against everything he didn't want to feel. There were 3 new contracts, a territorial dispute with the Carrera organization that needed to be resolved without open conflict, a money laundering arrangement that required restructuring after a key intermediary had become federally inconvenient. He worked 16-hour days. He came home late and the lights upstairs were already off. He started sleeping in the chair in his office. He told himself it was because he was working late. He knew it was because the bed felt like an accusation. December came and he had the attorney begin preparing the papers. He didn't tell anyone. Not Marco, not his older brother Dante, who called twice a month from Boston, not a single person in his organization or his life. He sat across from his attorney in a conference room with city views on 3 sides, and told the man what he wanted, and the man did not look surprised. Attorneys who work for people like Adrian Voss learn very quickly not to look surprised. And 6 days later, the envelope arrived. Adrian had signed his portion and then set it down and not moved it for 11 days. He told himself he was waiting for the right moment. He was not waiting for the right moment. He was waiting for something to tell him he was wrong about all of it, and nothing was coming, and the waiting was starting to feel like its own kind of cowardice. The morning of the 12th day, a Thursday, Elena told him she was going to her mother's again for the weekend. She said it the same way she always said these things now, plainly, without much eye contact, efficiently. She had her bag packed by the time he came downstairs. She was standing at the kitchen counter drinking coffee with both hands wrapped around the mug, her coat already on. He looked at her standing there in the kitchen of their home. He looked at the coat and the bag and the careful blankness in her face that he no longer knew how to read. He said, "Elena." She looked up. He stood there for a moment with 11 days of silence and 32 pages in an envelope upstairs, and everything he did not know how to say filling his chest until it was hard to breathe properly. And then he said, "Drive safe." She nodded. She picked up her bag. She left. He stood in the kitchen alone and listened to the car back out of the driveway and the sound of it fading down the street. Then he picked up the envelope off the desk and walked to his car and drove toward Queens because he was done waiting for something that was never going to come to him, because he needed to know, because 12 years was too long, and the woman in that kitchen with the careful blank face was still the same woman who had laughed at him at a fundraiser and asked him why he'd come, and he could not hand her 32 pages without at least looking her in the eye one final time. He drove without bodyguards. He drove without a weapon. He drove as just a man, which was the most terrifying thing Adrian Voss had been in years. He pulled onto Rose's Street just after 7 in the evening. The house was lit from inside, warm yellow light against the February dark. He parked across the street and sat there for a moment with the engine idling and the envelope on the passenger seat and his hands on the wheel, because he needed one breath before he did this. He was reaching for the door handle when he heard it. Elena's voice. The front window was cracked open despite the cold, and her voice carried across the small front yard with a clarity that stopped him absolutely. She was crying. Not quietly, not with the dignified restraint he might have expected from her, but with the raw, broken sound of someone who has been holding something for so long that their body can no longer manage the weight of it. He sat completely still with his hand on the door handle, and then he heard her say his name. Not calling for him, not angry, just saying it, the way you say the name of something you're terrified of losing. Adrian's hand dropped from the door handle. His throat closed. He sat in the dark car on a street in Queens in February, and he listened, and what he heard in the next few minutes would not simply change what he believed about his marriage. It would obliterate it entirely. He did not get out of the car. Not yet. Not while her voice was still coming through that window, cracked open against the February cold like someone had needed air and forgotten to close it back. Adrian sat with both hands on his thighs now, engine off, the street quiet except for Elena's crying and the distant sound of a television from the house 2 doors down. The envelope sat on the passenger seat. He didn't look at it. He listened. Her voice was muffled but close enough. The window was directly facing the street and the curtain was thin, and whatever was happening inside that front room was happening maybe 15 feet from where he sat. He could hear Rosa's voice, too. Lower, steadier, the controlled tone of a woman trying to hold something together that keeps trying to come apart. He couldn't make out the words yet, but he could hear Elena's breathing between sobs, the way it hitched and caught, and it was that sound, specific, intimate, wrong in a way he had no language for, that kept him in the car. Because it wasn't the sound of a woman who had stopped loving her husband. He had been listening to Elena Marquez for 12 years. He knew how she sounded when she was relieved, when she was angry, when she was trying to disguise that she was afraid. He had, over the course of the past year, cataloged her silences and her exits and her careful avoidances and told himself a story about what they meant. The story he had told himself had felt airtight. Sitting in this car, in the dark, listening to her breathe like something was breaking inside her chest, the story was already developing cracks. He needed to hear the words. He got out of the car slowly, closed the door without sound, and crossed the street. Rosa Marquez's front yard was small and flat, the grass winter-dead and pale under the streetlight. A ceramic pot near the front step held the remains of something that had been a flowering plant in warmer months. Adrian moved along the narrow strip of shadow beside the porch railing, keeping away from the cone of yellow light coming from the window, and stood still with his back against the cold brick of the house's front face. Now he could hear them clearly. "You have to tell him," Rosa's voice, flat, without negotiation in it, not asking. "I can't." Elena's voice was wrecked, the kind of hoarse that comes from crying for a long time before a conversation even begins. "Elena, I can't, Mom. You don't understand what he'd do." "I know exactly what he'd do. He'd try to fix it. He'd destroy himself trying to fix it. There's a difference." A pause. Adrian could hear the shift of weight, someone moving in the room. The treatments are expensive, Elena said. How expensive? It doesn't matter. It matters to me. You're my daughter. Then let me handle it. You're not handling it. You're disappearing. Rosa's voice cracked for just a moment before she pulled it back. You come here every few weeks looking worse than the time before, and you tell me you're managing, and then I watch you sit in my kitchen and not eat anything, and you go home and you smile at that man and pretend. I'm not pretending. The sharpness in Elena's voice was sudden and defensive. I love him. That's exactly why I can't tell him. That doesn't make any sense. It makes complete sense if you know Adrian. Another silence. Adrian's back was flat against the brick and he wasn't breathing the way he should have been. His chest felt like something was sitting on it. Not quite pain, but pressure. The physical expression of a realization that hasn't finished arriving yet. He'll blame himself, Elena said, and her voice had gone quiet now, the way voices go when someone is saying something they've said to themselves so many times it's worn smooth. You know he will. He'll decide it's because of the stress, because of his life, his world, everything he's pulled me into by proximity. He'll decide he's the reason I'm sick, and there won't be any convincing him otherwise because Adrian doesn't accept halfway conclusions. He commits to things completely. That's the only way he knows how to be. Elena? And then he'll start dismantling everything. The organization, the assets, the arrangements it took him 15 years to build. He'll throw all of it away because he thinks money can solve it, because he thinks if he just finds the right doctor, the right hospital, the right experimental program, he can fix it. And then when he's burned everything down, he'll realize he can't fix it, and it'll kill him. That'll kill him worse than anything else could. Rosa was quiet. I can't let that happen, Elena said. I won't. Adrian stood in the cold dark with those words landing on him one at a time. He had spent 11 days with an envelope on his desk and a version of Elena in his head. A woman growing distant, growing cold, choosing absence over presence. And he had built an entire architecture of hurt around that version. He had been meticulous about it, the way he was meticulous about everything. Cataloged every missed dinner, every weekend away, every conversation that ended before it started. He had taken all of it and assembled it into a single clean conclusion. She was done. He had been so certain. The certainty had felt like solid ground. He was standing on open air. Bolt. He didn't knock on the door. Not that night. He couldn't. He walked back to the car on legs that felt strange under him, and he sat behind the wheel for a long time in the dark without starting the engine. The envelope was still on the passenger seat. He picked it up and held it for a moment, and then put it in the glove compartment and closed it. He wasn't sure why. Some reflex toward tidiness, maybe. Some need to put the thing somewhere he wasn't directly looking at it. He drove back to Manhattan. He drove carefully, both hands on the wheel, under the speed limit, stopping fully at every light. He was aware of doing these things with a deliberateness that suggested his body was compensating for the fact that his mind was not available for ordinary tasks. The city moved around him the way it always did at this hour. Taxis, delivery trucks, the scattered pedestrians of a February night, and he passed through it without registering any of it. He got home. He went upstairs. He stood in the doorway of the bedroom for a long time, looking at the bed that he'd been avoiding for months. Then he went and sat down on the edge of it, just sat there. The room was dark and cold because he kept the heat low when he slept alone, and the house had learned his patterns by now, adjusting itself around his solitude without comment. He put his face in his hands. He had built an empire on the principle that information was power, that if you understood the landscape clearly, the loyalties, the pressures, the fault lines, you could navigate anything. He had never been wrong about an enemy. He had been catastrophically wrong about his wife. He didn't sleep that night. By 4 a.m, he was in his office with the city lights spread below him and his second coffee going cold on the desk, running back through every month of the past year with the new information recalibrating everything like a lens being replaced. Every absence he'd read as withdrawal. Every phone call she'd taken privately. The weight loss he'd attributed to detachment. The exhaustion he'd told himself was emotional. It wasn't detachment. It was illness. It was treatment. It was a woman protecting the person she loved by breaking her own heart quietly, so his could keep beating. He thought about all the times he'd noticed something was wrong and had said nothing. The dinners where he'd sat across from her and felt the distance and responded by widening it himself, retreating further into work, into silence, into the cold professional composure that had always been his default when he didn't know what to do with something he felt. He had read her silence as abandonment and answered it with his own. How many times had she been sitting across from him carrying something enormous, something terrifying, and he had looked at her and decided she was the problem? The thought made him sick. Not a metaphorical sick, an actual physical wave of nausea that he had to breathe through, gripping the edge of the desk. He stood up and went to the window and pressed his forehead against the cold glass and stood there for a while. When his phone buzzed, it was Marco, calling early the way Marco occasionally did when something was developing on the street that needed Adrian's attention before it got legs. Adrian let it go to voicemail. Then he called back 2 minutes later because there were men depending on him, and the world did not pause for personal reckonings. "What is it?" he said. "Castilla's people are moving product through the Hoboken route again." Marco's voice was careful. He'd heard something in Adrian's tone. "Who authorized it this time?" "Nobody on our side." "Then it's a provocation." "Looks like it." Adrian closed his eyes. "Handle it quietly. No escalation without my direct sign-off. I want the message delivered that they've been noticed, nothing more. Can you manage that without me for today?" A pause. This was unusual. "Yeah, I can manage it." "Good." He hung up. He stood there a moment longer, looking at the city. He needed to think about how to do this, how to approach Elena without revealing that he'd been standing outside her mother's house listening through an open window. Because that was not an entry point that led anywhere good. He needed to find a way to open a door she'd deliberately closed, to get her to tell him what she'd made such enormous sacrifices to keep from him, without making her feel surveilled or cornered, or like she'd lost control of the one thing she'd been trying to control. He needed to be something he was not practiced at being, patient. Elena came home Sunday evening. He heard the car in the driveway at 6:30. He was in the kitchen, deliberately, intentionally, not in his office where he'd have been invisible behind the closed door, sitting at the kitchen island with a cup of coffee and the newspaper he hadn't been reading. When she came in through the side door, he looked up. She stopped when she saw him. It was a small hesitation, less than a second, but he saw it. She wasn't used to finding him in the kitchen at this hour. He was usually inaccessible on Sunday evenings, deep in whatever work had accumulated over the weekend. "Hey," she said. "Hey." He kept his voice level, neutral, safe. "There's food. I had Celia leave something in the oven." Elena set her bag down by the door. She was wearing a coat he recognized, the charcoal wool one she'd had for 3 years, and her face was... He looked at her face and made himself really look at it without the filter of the story he'd been telling himself. She looked tired. The specific tired of someone who has been fighting something their body isn't winning against. There were shadows under her eyes that weren't there a year ago, and her cheekbones were more pronounced than they'd been, and he'd noticed all of these things and filed them under abandonment, and the fact of that, the specific wrongness of it, sat in his stomach like a stone. "I'm not very hungry," she said. "Sit with me anyway." She looked at him. He held her gaze and kept his expression open, which cost him something. He was not a man who let himself look open, in general, but he did it. She read people accurately, always had. He needed her to read this accurately. She came and sat across from him. They were quiet for a moment. He refilled his coffee and didn't speak, and she sat with her coat still on and her hands folded on the counter, and they occupied the same space without the usual careful distance they'd been maintaining. "How's your mother?" he said. "She's okay." A pause. "Her hip has been bothering her." "You should hire someone to be there during the week." Elena looked at him. "She won't allow that." "She doesn't have to allow it. It just has to show up and be persistent." Something moved across Elena's face. Not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. The ghost of a response she'd been suppressing. "You can't just deploy someone at my mother. I deploy people at more resistant targets than Rosa." This time she almost did smile. He watched it happen, and then not happen. "Adrian?" Her voice dropped. The almost smile was gone. I'm tired. I know. I just... She stopped, started again. I don't have a lot left at the end of the day right now. I'm sorry. He looked at her across the kitchen island. He thought, tell me. He thought, I already know. He thought, I'm sorry I made you carry this alone by being exactly the kind of man you were afraid to tell. He said, you don't have to apologize. She looked at him, a real look, not the careful surface-level eye contact they'd been managing for months. He held it. Get some rest, he said. I'll be up later. She nodded. She picked up her bag and went upstairs. He sat in the kitchen for a long time after. He tried it her way for 2 weeks. He made himself available without being intrusive. He came home at reasonable hours. He sat in rooms with her instead of disappearing into his office. He did not ask questions she wasn't ready to answer. He told himself he was giving her space to come to him, that she would come to him when she was ready, that the worst thing he could do now was crowd her with what he knew. The 2 weeks were agony. He watched her take her medication with the careful casualness of someone who had practiced making it look unremarkable. A small amber bottle she tucked out of sight quickly, hand moving with the trained efficiency of habit. He watched her some mornings when she thought he was still upstairs, and she stood at the kitchen counter and held the counter's edge like she needed it, head down, breathing through something. He watched her put herself together and climb the stairs and be fine. He watched her be fine 12 times a day, and it was the bravest thing he'd ever seen, and it was destroying him. By the 3rd week, his composure had started to develop fractures. Marco noticed first. Marco always noticed, not because he was perceptive in a warm or emotional way, but because he monitored Adrian the way Adrian had taught him to monitor everything, systematically, with attention to deviation from baseline. You're distracted, Marco said. They were in the back of the car, moving through midtown traffic toward a meeting with the accountants who manage the organization's clean revenue streams. I'm not. You've checked your phone 4 times in the last 10 minutes. I'm expecting something. From who? Adrian looked at him. Marco looked back. He did not push further, but there was something in his expression that was almost, not quite, concern. The Castilla situation, Adrian said. I want it resolved this week, quietly. I don't want it sitting open. It's being handled. Then find something else that needs handling. Marco turned to look out the window. There's a situation with the Harlem arrangement, he said. Benedetti's nephew is pushing weight in territory he hasn't earned. Talk to Benedetti. He knows. He's not stopping it. Then the conversation should be more persuasive. I can make it more persuasive. I know you can. That's why I'm telling you to do it. The car moved through traffic. Adrian's phone was in his pocket, and he didn't look at it, which cost him something. He had left Elena at home this morning in the kitchen. She'd been sitting very still with her coffee, and she had not been reading or looking at anything, just sitting. And he had kissed the top of her head on his way out, something he hadn't done in months, a reflex that surprised both of them. And she had gone still under it for a moment, and then she had reached up and put her hand briefly against his arm before letting it drop. It had been 18 seconds of human contact. He had been thinking about it for 6 hours. Shit, the call came on a Tuesday. Elena's phone, left on the kitchen counter while she was in the shower, he wasn't looking at it, was walking past it, but the screen lit up with a call from a number labeled Dr. K, and the name hit him with the physical force of confirmation. He had known. He had heard her say it with his own ears, standing outside her mother's house. But knowing something and having it confirmed in front of you in the ordinary light of your own kitchen are 2 different things, and the difference landed hard. He stood there looking at the lit screen. He did not answer it. He walked into the living room and stood at the window with his hands in his pockets and the city below him, and he was still standing there when Elena came downstairs 10 minutes later and saw him and stopped. What happened? She said immediately. She read rooms the way he read rooms. Nothing's happened, he said. She looked at him for a long moment. He kept his back to her, watching the city. Adrian? I'm fine. You're not fine. He turned around. She was standing at the bottom of the stairs in a sweater he recognized, her hair still slightly damp, and she was looking at him with an expression that was almost fear, not fear of him, fear of the conversation they were standing on the edge of. He could see her deciding whether to back away from it. He was done with backing away. "Tell me what's going on," he said. Flat. Not a request. Her face closed immediately. He saw it happen. The deliberate assembling of composure, the careful return to neutral. "Nothing's going on." "Elena." "I'm tired, Adrian. I told you. That's not what I'm asking about." Silence. "I'm asking you to tell me what's going on with you." He kept his voice even, but he could feel the control in it, the deliberateness of it. And she could too. She knew him well enough to know the difference between calm and carefully maintained calm. "I'm asking you to stop." He stopped. "I'm asking you to let me in." Her eyes changed, something in them that he couldn't name and didn't want to look away from. "Adrian, don't," she said quietly. "Don't what?" "Don't make me have this conversation tonight." "Then when?" She looked at him. Her hands were at her sides and one of them was gripping the hem of her sweater, the way she did when she was keeping herself still. He had always known that detail about her. He knew 1,000 details about her, the way you know the particular sounds of a house you've lived in long enough. Intimate, automatic, something you'd only notice if it stopped. "When you're ready," he said, "I'll be here." He went back upstairs. He sat on the edge of the bed and put his hands flat on his knees and stared at the opposite wall and waited for his heart rate to normalize, which took considerably longer than it should have. Downstairs, he heard nothing. Then, very quietly, he heard her cry. Just briefly. Barely a minute. Then silence again. And the sound of her moving through the kitchen, and the tap running, and the ordinary sounds of a woman putting herself back together in a house where she believed she was bearing everything alone. He did not go downstairs. He sat with his hands on his knees and the sound of her crying moving through him like current through wire, and he made a decision. He was done waiting for her to come to him because Elena was not going to come to him. She had decided, out of love, that coming to him was the wrong thing to do, and she was going to hold that decision until it broke her, because that was the kind of woman she was. And he had loved that quality in her for 12 years, and right now it was the thing standing between them like a wall. He was going to have to go to her. He was going to have to walk through everything she'd built to keep him out. He reached for his phone and called Marco. "I need everything you can find," he said, "on a doctor with the initial K working in oncology or internal medicine in the greater New York area, with a patient named Elena Voss on record. Medical privacy laws don't apply to me." Marco was quiet for exactly 2 seconds. "I'll have it by morning," he said. Adrian hung up. He sat in the dark bedroom of the home he shared with his wife, who was downstairs pretending she was not falling apart. And for the first time in his life, he genuinely did not know whether what he was about to do would save them or shatter whatever remained of the trust between them, and the not knowing sat in his chest like a blade. And he did not sleep that night at all. Marco delivered the information at 6:47 in the morning. He came to the house personally, which he only did when something was sensitive enough that he didn't want it moving through phones or intermediaries. Adrian heard the car in the driveway and was already downstairs, dressed, coffee in hand, standing at the kitchen counter when Marco let himself in through the side entrance with the key Adrian had given him years ago for emergencies. Marco was carrying a manila folder. He set it on the counter between them and didn't say anything. Adrian looked at the folder for a moment. Then he set down his coffee and opened it. The first page was a patient intake form with Elena's name at the top. Below it, in the clean and personal typography of medical administration, was a series of dates, a diagnosis, and a treatment protocol that Adrian read once, then read again. Not because he hadn't understood it the first time, but because some part of him needed the repetition the way you need to press on a bruise to confirm it's real. The diagnosis was 14 months old. She had been carrying this for 14 months. "Who's the doctor?" Adrian said. His voice came out level. He was aware of making it level. "Kessler, David Kessler, oncologist, Presbyterian Hospital, good reputation, been her primary since the diagnosis." Marco's voice was careful, the verbal equivalent of moving through a room where something breakable had already fallen and you weren't sure what else was unstable. "He's not the problem." Adrian looked up. "There's a second name in there," Marco said. "Page 3. Adrian turned to page 3. The name was Raymond Castilla. He stood very still. His organization has been running a medical debt collection operation on the side, Marco said, targeting people with large outstanding balances at private treatment facilities, buying the debt from the facilities at discount, then collecting it through methods that aren't available to legitimate agencies. He paused. Elena's treatment at the Meridian Clinic, the private infusion center she's been using for the past 8 months. She got behind on payments, about $60,000 behind. The clinic sold the debt 3 months ago. Adrian put the folder down on the counter very carefully. To Castilla, he said, to one of his shell companies. Yeah. The kitchen was very quiet. Somewhere upstairs, a pipe made a small sound as the heat moved through it. Outside the window, the February light was just starting to come up, gray and flat and without warmth. She doesn't know, Marco said. It was not quite a question. She doesn't know, Adrian said. He picked up his coffee, put it down without drinking it. The ceramic made a small, precise sound against the counter. The Hoboken provocation, he said. Yeah. That wasn't about territory. No. Adrian looked at the folder on the counter, at Elena's name at the top of the first page, printed in the impersonal font of an institution that did not know her. 14 months of treatments, the amber pill bottle she moved out of sight every morning, the morning she stood at the counter, holding its edge. All of it, running underneath their marriage like a current he had not known how to read because she had worked with precision and love and absolute stubbornness to make sure he couldn't, and Raymond Castilla had found it anyway. How long has he known? Adrian said. We're not sure. At least 2 months. He's been sitting on it. Looks like it. Waiting. Marco didn't answer because the answer was obvious. Castilla had been waiting for the right moment to use it. The Hoboken route was not a provocation for its own sake. It was a signal. A demonstration that he was willing to move in Adrian's space. A preliminary designed to establish pressure before the actual conversation happened. The actual conversation would have been, I know about your wife, I know what she owes, and I know that you don't know. That conversation was leverage. That conversation was a weapon that Castilla had been sharpening for 2 months while Adrian had been sitting in his own house misreading the woman he loved. Adrian turned and walked out of the kitchen. Marco didn't follow immediately. He knew when to give space. It was one of the things that made him useful. Adrian went to his office and closed the door and stood at the window for a long time. The city was waking up below him. Delivery trucks, taxis changing shifts. The particular gray-blue light of a winter morning in New York that had always had a quality he associated with the beginning of things. New days, new problems, new decisions that needed to be made before the light changed. He was running 2 calculations simultaneously, and they kept interfering with each other. The first was tactical. Castilla had moved against him using Elena as a vector, which meant Castilla had made a catastrophic error in judgment. Not because Adrian was powerful, though he was, but because the specific thing Castilla had touched was the one thing in Adrian's life that did not have a proportional response. You miscalculate with Adrian Voss and you lose a contract or a territory or a percentage of your operation. You come after Elena and you lose everything. Castilla knew this, which meant either he was more desperate than Adrian had realized, or he believed he had enough leverage to make the threat stick. The second calculation was harder. He had to tell Elena what he knew, not just what Marco had found in the folder, what he had heard outside her mother's house 3 weeks ago. The full accounting of how he had come to know what he knew, including the 11 days with the divorce papers and the drive to Queens without bodyguards, and the thing he had done that she had specifically, deliberately, at enormous personal cost tried to prevent. He had to tell her, and she was going to be, he didn't know what she was going to be. Angry was too small a word. Betrayed might be the right word, except that she had been protecting him by keeping her secret, and he had gone around her protection without her knowledge. And the fact that he'd done it out of love did not make it something other than what it was. He had invaded the most private thing she had. He had done it with the best possible intentions. He was going to have to stand in front of her and say all of it. He turned from the window and picked up his phone and called his attorney. I need you to identify all legal and financial instruments available to me to acquire and retire a medical debt currently held by a shell company connected to a man named Raymond Castilla, he said. $60,000 in whatever interest or fees they've added. I want it done today. That's Adrian, that kind of acquisition through a shell company takes, I don't want it through normal channels. I want it through whatever channels make it happen today. Find them. He hung up and called Marco. I want a complete picture of Castilla's current exposure, he said when Marco picked up. Assets, debts, outstanding arrangements, anything he has that he doesn't want looked at too closely. I want it in 2 hours. 2 hours is aggressive. Then be aggressive. He hung up. He put his phone face down on the desk and pressed both palms flat against the desktop and took a breath. Then another. He was doing the thing he did when a situation was moving fast and he needed to be faster, narrowing his focus to what was immediately actionable, setting aside everything that required more than he could control right now, operating with the discipline that had kept him alive and functional in a world that rewarded neither sentimentality nor hesitation. It worked for about 4 minutes. Then he thought about Elena standing at the kitchen counter this morning, holding her coffee with both hands, not knowing that a man had been building a weapon out of her illness for 2 months, and the discipline fractured. He sat down. He put his face in his hands. He sat there for a moment that he would not have allowed anyone to witness. Then he stood up, straightened his jacket, and went to find his wife. She was upstairs in the small sitting room off the bedroom that she used as a reading room, a narrow space with 2 chairs and a window seat, and shelves that held the books she'd accumulated across their 12 years. She was sitting in the chair by the window with a book in her lap that she was not reading. She looked up when he appeared in the doorway. She could read him. She always could. He watched her see something in his face and go still the way people go still when they recognize that what's coming is going to require everything they have. "Close the book," he said. She closed it. He came in and sat in the other chair, the one facing hers, maybe 4 feet between them. He put his hands on his knees. He looked at her. She looked back at him. Her face was careful and controlled, and her hands were folded over the closed book in her lap, and there was something in her eyes that was not quite fear, but was adjacent to it, the specific look of a person bracing. "I know," he said. 2 words. He watched them land. Her expression did not collapse immediately. She was too controlled for that. But he saw something shift behind her eyes. A readjustment, a recalibration, and her hands tightened almost imperceptibly over the book. "Adrian, I've known for 3 weeks," he said. "I went to your mother's house. I heard you through the window." The silence that followed was the heaviest thing in the room. She looked at him for a long time. He held it. He owed her that. To hold it without flinching, to let her see what he was and what he'd done, and not dress it up. "You listened," she said. Her voice was very quiet, very flat. "I heard you. I didn't plan it. I was there to—" He stopped. "I had the divorce papers. I was going to give them to you." Something happened in her face, a compression, like something falling inward. "I heard you tell your mother why you didn't want to tell me," he said. "I heard what you were afraid of. And I need you to understand that everything you were afraid of, everything you sacrificed to prevent, I need you to understand that I know you did it because you love me. And I need you to understand that none of it changes what I should have done, which is be someone you could tell." She was looking at him with her mouth slightly open and her hand still on the book, and he couldn't entirely read her expression, which almost never happened, which told him how far outside ordinary territory they both were. "Why didn't you say something?" she said. 3 weeks. "Because I was trying to figure out how to do this without making it worse." "Did you figure it out?" "No." Her breath came out slowly. She looked at the window. The light was gray and flat outside it, and the street below was quiet, and she looked at it for a while before she looked back at him. "How bad is it?" he said. She understood what he was asking. "It's treatable. Dr. Kessler is... He thinks the protocol is working. There's still a long way to go, but the indicators are..." She stopped. Something moved across her face. "It's treatable, Adrian. I'm not dying. I want you to hear that first." "Hear it?" "I should have told you." "Yes. I was scared." "I know. I know you know." Her voice cracked for the first time, just slightly, just at the edge of it, before she held it. I knew exactly what you'd do." "What would I do?" She looked at him. "Everything. You'd do everything. You'd tear the world apart. He held her gaze. And that was something you needed to protect me from. Yes. Because you love me. Because I love you, and because I know how you are. The crack in her voice was more present now. I know how you carry things. I know how you blame yourself. And I can't watch you. Elena, she stopped. There's something else, he said. And I need you to listen to me carefully, and I need you to not make any decisions about it until I tell you that I've handled it. Can you do that? She read his face. The fear that came into her eyes then was different from what had been there before, sharper. What did you do? She said. I haven't done anything yet, but I know something that you need to know. He held himself very still. Raymond Castilla knows about your treatment. He's been holding the debt from the Meridian Clinic for 3 months, the debt you're behind on. Elena went white, not pale, white. The color leaving her face with a completeness that he'd only seen in people who'd received genuinely catastrophic news, and he'd delivered a great deal of catastrophic news in his life. She stopped. How? The clinic sold the debt. It happens. They don't know who they're selling to. He knows about my... Yes. She stood up. The book fell from her lap to the floor, and neither of them picked it up. She moved to the window and stood there with her back to him, and her arms wrapped around herself, and he could see her shoulders working, could see the physical effort of holding herself together from the back. He was going to use it, she said. He was going to use it. Against you. Against me. Through you. He gave her a moment. He's been moving into my territory in Hoboken. That wasn't about territory. That was preliminary. He was building toward a conversation. She turned around. Her face was... It was not the controlled, careful face he was used to. It was open in a way that was almost hard to look at. Too many things at once in it, and one of them was something he recognized as fury. He was going to use my illness, she said, each word separate and precise, like she was making sure she understood her own sentence. Yes, to come at you. Yes. Because he knew you didn't know. Adrian said nothing. He didn't need to. She looked at him for a long time. He sat in the chair and let her look, and didn't try to manage what she saw, because there was nothing left to manage between them now. Everything was out. The divorce papers. The window in Queens. The 14 months she'd spent protecting him from a truth he could have handled better than she'd imagined if she'd given him the chance. Castilla with his shell companies and his bought debt, and his 2 months of patient, calculated weapon building. All of it in this room, between them. He was counting on our distance, Elena said slowly. The fury was still there, but it had moved behind her eyes now, was being processed into something colder and more precise. He found out, and then he watched, and he decided the best time to use it was when things between us were, when you'd be most... She stopped. He wanted you off balance. Yes. He wanted you to be already hurting when he came to you with it. Yes. She looked at him with something in her face he hadn't seen before, not in this combination, grief and anger and something that was almost a decision. What are you going to do? She said. I'm going to retire the debt first, he said. Today. Whatever it takes. After that, the Castilla situation will be addressed through appropriate channels. Appropriate channels, she repeated. Her voice was flat. This is not a conversation about methods, he said. This is me telling you that it will be handled and that nothing Castilla has or knows will touch you. I need you to trust that. She looked at him for a long time. I should have trusted you from the beginning, she said. You had reasons. I had fear. Fear is a reason. It was the wrong reason. Her voice was steady now, steadier than he expected, with something underneath it that was resolving into something harder. I spent a year protecting you from something you could have handled, and while I was doing that, I let someone else find out, someone who would use it against us. She looked at the window again. I was so afraid of what you'd do that I didn't consider who else might be watching. Adrian was quiet. That's on me, she said. It's on Castilla. It's on both. She turned back to him. What does he want? We don't know yet. He hasn't made his move. But he will. He was going to. Now the calculation changes. Because you know. Because I know. She stood at the window with the gray light behind her and her arms still wrapped around herself, and he sat in the chair and looked at her, and the room was very quiet. Outside, a car passed slowly on the street. Somewhere down the block, a dog was barking at something with the steady, irritable persistence of an animal that has decided its concern is legitimate. What happens next? She said. Not scared, asking for the actual information. He stood up. He moved to her, not quickly, and she didn't move away from him. He stopped close enough that if he put his hand out, he could reach her, but he didn't reach. Next, I make 3 phone calls, he said. And then I'm going to come back in here and I'm going to sit with you for the rest of the morning. And you're going to tell me about the treatment, all of it, from the beginning. And I am going to listen. She looked up at him. Her eyes were wet now, but none of it had fallen. And after that, she said, after that, we're going to have the conversation we should have had 14 months ago. He held her gaze. And I am not going to do any of the things you were afraid I'd do. Which things? I'm not going to blame myself. I'm not going to tear the empire down. I'm not going to treat this like something I can solve by force. He paused. I'm going to stand next to you while you fight it. That's all. I'm going to be here. Something broke in her face then, quietly, without drama, just the last of whatever she'd been holding dissolving. She leaned forward and put her forehead against his chest. He wrapped his arms around her and held her, and neither of them spoke. And outside, the February light continued its flat gray indifferent progress across the window. And downstairs, his phone was already buzzing with the first of what would become a very complicated day. He held her and didn't move. The phone could wait. Marco could wait. Castilla was going to learn, in the coming hours, what it cost to calculate wrong about Adrian Voss. But that was a later conversation, a different room, a version of himself that he would have to put back on like a coat he'd temporarily set aside. Right now, he was here. Just here. And then his phone stopped buzzing and started ringing. Not Marco's line, not his attorney, but a number he hadn't seen in over a year, a number that made the back of his neck go cold. And he read the screen over Elena's shoulder and felt the bottom of the situation drop out entirely, because the name on the screen was not Castilla, and it was not anyone in his organization, and it was the one name in his life that he had believed was no longer capable of reaching him, his brother Dante. Calling from a number that should not have existed, from a phone that Adrian had been told, 18 months ago, had been destroyed. He stepped back from Elena. Not far. Just enough to see the screen clearly, to make sure he was reading it right, to give himself the 1 second he needed before he answered. Elena felt the change in him immediately. She was still close enough to feel his chest stop mid-breath, and she pulled back and looked up at his face and then down at the phone. She didn't know the number. She didn't know what the name meant. I have to take this, he said. He walked out of the sitting room and into the hallway and answered on the 4th ring. Dante. His voice came out flat, controlled. The voice he used when he needed to sound like he wasn't running calculations behind every word. Brother? The voice on the other end was unhurried, easy. The voice of a man who had arranged this call to his own satisfaction and was enjoying the moment of being heard. It's been a long time. 18 months. 18 months, Dante agreed. You look well, by the way. Adrian's hand tightened on the phone. You've had eyes on me. I've had eyes on the things that matter to me, same as always. A pause. Same as you. The hallway was quiet. Through the sitting room door, he could feel Elena on the other side of it, could feel the specific quality of her stillness. She was not moving away and not moving closer, just present, waiting. This phone was destroyed, Adrian said. That phone was destroyed, Dante said. This is a different one. How long? How long have I had this one, or how long have I been back in the city? Adrian said nothing. 8 weeks, Dante said, give or take. 8 weeks. The same window as Castilla. Adrian stood in his hallway, and the two timelines ran parallel in his head and then converged into something that made his vision sharpen the way it did right before a situation turned lethal. "You know Castilla," he said. The pause on the other end was 2 seconds too long. "I know a lot of people," Dante said. "That's not what I asked." Adrian. The easy quality in his brother's voice had not changed. That was the thing about Dante that had always been most dangerous. He was relaxed in situations that would make other men sweat, and his relaxation was not performance. It was the genuine calm of someone who believed he had already won. "I called because I think it's time we had a conversation. A real one. In person." "Tell me where you are." "The Meridian Hotel on 54th, Suite 14. Come alone." "I don't come alone to anything." "You will to this," Dante said, "because what I have to tell you isn't something you want witnessed by your people." Another pause. "It concerns Elena." The name in his brother's mouth landed like a hand on a wound. "1 hour," Adrian said. He hung up. He went back into the sitting room. Elena was standing where he'd left her, arms still crossed, watching the door. She read his face before he said a word. "What happened?" she said. "I need you to do something for me." He moved to her. He took her hands, both of them, holding them between his, which was not a gesture he made casually, and she felt the weight of it. "I need you to go to your mother's house. Now, this morning. Take the car. Take Serena," the female member of his security who Elena knew and had always accepted, "and go. Don't come back until I call you." Her eyes were steady on his. "Who was that?" "Someone I need to deal with." "Who?" He looked at her for a moment. She deserved the truth. She had always deserved it, and he had spent too long deciding what she could handle. "My brother," he said. Her mouth opened slightly. Dante Voss had been a name she'd heard twice in their 12 years together, both times delivered the way you deliver the name of something that ended badly. She knew he existed. She knew there had been a severance. She'd never pushed for the details because some doors in Adrian's life had always been closed, and she had respected that. "He's in the city," Adrian said. "He's connected to Castilla somehow. I don't know the shape of it yet." "Is it dangerous?" "I don't know yet." "Adrian, I need you safe while I find out." He held her hands tighter for a moment. "That's the only thing I need right now. Can you give me that?" She looked at him. He could see her wanting to push further, wanting to argue, wanting to be in the room where things were being decided. And he understood that impulse completely, because it was the same impulse he carried in every room he entered. But she looked at his face, and she saw something that made her stop. "Call me," she said, "the moment you know something." "The moment I know something." She nodded. He pulled her close for 1 second, brief, tight, without ceremony. And then he let her go and went to find Marco. He did not take Marco into the hotel. He left him in the car on 54th with 2 other men positioned on the block in configurations that Castilla's people would recognize as professional, and that Dante, if he'd arranged anything outside that hotel suite, would understand as a message about the limits of Adrian's compliance with the request to come alone. He went in through the lobby alone. The Meridian was the kind of hotel that catered to people who paid for invisibility. Quiet staff, no branded anything, rooms that cost enough to ensure the clientele never needed to interact with each other in elevators. Adrian crossed the lobby without looking at the front desk and took the elevator to the 14th floor. Suite 14 was at the end of a carpeted hallway that absorbed sound the way expensive things absorb everything, effortlessly, without comment. He knocked once. The door opened. Dante Voss was 51 years old and looked like what Adrian might have been if the same raw material had been finished differently. He was heavier than 18 months ago, not in a soft way, but in the settled way of a man who had been living without the particular vigilance that kept Adrian lean. He had their father's jaw and their mother's eyes, dark and quick, and he was wearing a jacket that cost as much as a small car, and standing in the doorway like a man who had arranged his furniture to his satisfaction and was inviting you to evaluate it. "You look terrible," Dante said. "You look alive," Adrian said. "I was told otherwise." Dante moved back into the room. Rumors of my inconvenience were overstated. He gestured at the seating area. A couch, 2 chairs, a low table with a bottle of bourbon, and 2 glasses already poured. Sit down. Adrian did not sit. He stood inside the door and looked at the room, registered the exits, the windows, the bathroom door standing open, the absence of any obvious third party. And then he looked at his brother. Talk, he said. Dante sat in one of the chairs and crossed one leg over the other and picked up his glass with the relaxed ease of someone who had arranged this meeting to run at his pace and was not going to be rushed out of that arrangement. Raymond Castilla, he said, is not your enemy. He's been moving in my territory, and he's been holding leverage over my wife. Define enemy differently. He's a tool, Dante said. Someone handed him the information about Elena. Someone suggested the approach. Someone arranged the debt acquisition through his shell company without Castilla fully understanding whose game he was playing in. The room was very still. That's someone, Adrian said. Dante looked at him. That someone was me. He said it the same way he said everything, without drama, without apology, with the simple directness of a man reporting a fact. Adrian stood very still. The bourbon on the table caught the light from the window and held it. Outside, the city moved with its usual indifference, 47 stories of hotel between this suite and street level, and the sound of it was entirely absent. Why? Adrian said. Because you were going to divorce her. Dante uncrossed his legs. Put the glass down. I had people watching the situation here. Not because I'm your enemy, but because you're my brother and you were making the worst decision of your life and somebody needed to have eyes on it. You had divorce papers on your desk. You were a month away from handing them to her. You had decided she'd stopped loving you and you were going to walk away. He looked at Adrian steadily. I needed you to find out the truth before you did something irreversible. The silence in the room had weight. You used my wife's illness, Adrian said. His voice was very quiet. I used the situation. You bought her medical debt through a man you knew I'd eventually trace. You arranged a territorial provocation so I'd look in Castilla's direction. You put Elena in the position of owing money to an organization. She was never in danger from Castilla. I had controls on that. You put her in the position, Adrian said again, each word distinct and separate, of owing money to an organization with the methods Castilla's people use. For 3 months, with a ceiling I managed personally, without her knowledge. Without her knowledge, yes. Adrian moved, not toward Dante. He moved to the window because the alternative was something he couldn't allow yet. He stood at the glass with his back to the room and both hands at his sides, and he breathed. Out, in, out. The city stretched below him in its gray February light, indifferent and enormous, and he stood over it and worked to stay in the part of himself that could think, rather than the part that wanted to put his brother through the window. You were going to let the conversation between me and Castilla happen, he said to the glass. You were going to let him come to me with the information about Elena's illness. And at some point, when? You were going to reveal yourself as the architect. When you'd already been through enough of it to understand what you nearly lost. A lesson, Adrian said, a correction. He turned around. Dante was watching him from the chair with those quick, dark eyes and an expression that was not quite regret, but something adjacent to it. Something that had the shape of caring without the texture of apology. She's sick, Adrian said. She spent 14 months managing treatment alone because she was terrified of what I'd do if I knew. And your solution was to put her in additional danger to teach me something. She was never in additional danger. You don't get to define what's dangerous for her. The quietness in his voice was not the quietness of control anymore. It was the quietness of something very large, moving very slowly. You don't get to run operations involving my wife. You don't get to determine what she's exposed to. Not you, not Castilla. Nobody. Dante was quiet. Tell me the full shape of it, Adrian said. Everything. Castilla's position, your arrangement with him, every piece of it. Now, Dante told him. It took 12 minutes. By the end of it, Adrian knew that Castilla had been a more or less willing instrument. He'd been given the debt at below discount acquisition cost, been told it was a play against a business rival, had not been told who the patient was or who her husband was until 3 weeks ago when Dante had finally revealed the target. At which point Castilla, not a stupid man, whatever else he was, had understood that he was holding something extremely volatile and had been trying to find a way to extract himself from the arrangement without losing face or money. The Hoboken provocation was not Castilla asserting himself. It was Castilla trying to open a dialogue. Adrian stood in the middle of the suite and processed this. "He's been trying to give it back," he said. "Without knowing how to do it, without looking like he's backing down," Dante said. "Yes. He's been in an impossible position for 3 weeks. The moment I told him whose wife he was holding paper on, he'd have paid the debt himself to get out from under it if he could have done it without me knowing. But you had controls on the exit. I needed the timing to be right. For me to find out. For you to find out before you handed her the papers." Adrian looked at his brother. He looked at him for a long time. Dante held it without shifting, with the specific patience of a man who has decided to absorb whatever is coming because he believes the thing he did was correct, despite the method. "We're not done with this conversation," Adrian said. "But right now I have 2 problems to resolve before we talk about us. You're going to release Castilla from whatever arrangement you have with him. Today. You're going to facilitate the full retirement of Elena's debt. Every dollar, every fee, through a mechanism that doesn't expose her name or her history to any additional parties. And you're going to do both of those things in the next 4 hours. And if I don't," Adrian looked at him. Dante looked back. The silence was 18 years long. "I will," Dante said, quietly. "I will." Adrian turned and walked to the door. "Adrian?" His brother's voice behind him. He stopped but didn't turn. "I did it because you matter to me. I did it because she matters to you. That doesn't make the method right. But it's the truth." Adrian put his hand on the door handle. "You should have come to me," he said. "You should have picked up the phone and told me my wife was sick and I was about to make the worst mistake of my life. You should have trusted me to hear it." A pause. "You hadn't spoken to me in 18 months, Dante said. "I know," Adrian said. "That's on me, too." He opened the door and walked out. But the elevator was empty going down. He stood in it with his hands at his sides and his reflection in the polished doors of the elevator looking back at him. Jacket, controlled expression, the posture of a man who has just received several pieces of information that are still reorganizing themselves into a coherent picture. He looked like himself. He didn't feel like himself. He felt like a man who had been running a navigation system with catastrophically wrong maps and had just, all at once, received the correct coordinates for every destination he'd been trying to reach for the past 14 months. The elevator reached the lobby. He walked through it without looking at anything. Marco was out of the car before Adrian reached the sidewalk, read the body language, knew something significant had happened, opened the door, and waited. Adrian got in. "The Castilla debt," he said when Marco got in the other side. "My brother is arranging the retirement. I want confirmation of completion within 4 hours. If it doesn't come, we handle it ourselves." Marco didn't ask about the brother. He would later when the moment was right. "And Castilla? Leave him alone. He's been played by someone who knew exactly what he was doing. We'll have a conversation eventually, but not today." "And your brother?" "Not today," Adrian said again. Marco nodded and started the car. Adrian looked out the window at the street moving past and called Elena. She picked up on the second ring. He could hear the ambient sound of her mother's kitchen, the particular quiet of it, a radio somewhere low, Rosa moving around in the background. "It's me," he said. "I know it's you." Her voice was careful, controlled, asking without asking. "It's not what I thought," he said. "It's more complicated. I'll explain everything tonight." He paused. "Are you okay?" "I'm okay." A pause. "Are you?" He looked at the city going past the car window. "I'm working on it," he said. She was quiet for a moment, then, "Come home when you can." "I'm coming home now." He hung up. Marco drove. The city moved around the car and Adrian sat in the back with his hands flat on his thighs and his mind running through everything that needed to happen in the next 24 hours. Dante, Castilla, the debt, The conversation with Elena that was going to cover every piece of the last 14 months without omission. And underneath all of it, persistent and quiet and completely unlike anything in his professional life, was the single clear fact that his wife was sick and he hadn't known, and she had tried to protect him from that. And his brother had used it, and all of it, every piece of this elaborate wreckage, had grown from a single seed. Two people who loved each other and had stopped being able to say so. He thought about the divorce papers in the glove compartment of his other car. He thought about Elena's hands when he'd held them in the sitting room that morning. He thought about Dante in that hotel suite with his bourbon and his quick dark eyes and the absolute conviction of a man who had done a terrible thing for reasons he could defend. He thought about Elena standing at the kitchen counter every morning with the amber pill bottle, moving it out of sight, performing normalcy for an audience of one. Spending 14 months being braver than anyone he had ever faced across a table and getting nothing from him but increasing distance in return. He was going to have to be different. Not different the way people say they'll be different when they mean they'll try harder at the same things. Actually different. The kind of different that requires you to acknowledge that the person you've been is not sufficient for the life you're in, and that the tools you've been using, control, distance, the professional management of every emotional situation, are not just inadequate, but actively destructive when applied to the one person who never needed to be managed. Elena didn't need to be managed. She needed to be met. He had been managing her for years and calling it love, and she had loved him anyway, in spite of it and around it, with a generosity he had absolutely not earned. And now she was sick. And she had been sick for 14 months, and every day of those 14 months she had gotten up and made herself functional and made herself present and absorbed his increasing coldness and continued, quietly, stubbornly, at enormous personal cost, to protect him. The car turned onto his street. He could see the house from the end of the block, the limestone facade, the iron fence, the bare oak trees at the property edge. He'd bought this house because it was defensible, good sightlines, solid perimeter. He'd thought about its security before he thought about whether it was a home. He thought about what Elena had done with it, the books on the shelves, the ceramic pot by the front step that held flowers in better seasons, the kitchen where she cooked on Sunday mornings when neither of them had anywhere to be, moving around in it with the particular ease of someone who has made a space genuinely hers. She had made a home out of a defensive position. He had not adequately appreciated that. The car stopped. He got out. He went inside. The house was quiet and empty without her. She was still at Rose's, would be for another few hours. And the quiet had a different quality now than it had had this morning, was not the quiet of avoidance and managed distance, but the quiet of a space waiting to be inhabited again. He walked through the kitchen and into the living room and stood there for a moment, and then he did something he almost never did in the middle of a day with things still unresolved. He sat down, just sat. In the living room of his own house, on the couch, without a phone in his hand or a plan being executed or a conversation being managed. He sat there for about 10 minutes. Then his phone rang. Marco, with confirmation that Dante had initiated the debt retirement, all 60,000 plus accrued fees, through a clean intermediary that would leave no trace connecting Elena's name to Castilla's organization. Done? Adrian said. Done, Marco said. He sat with the phone in his hand after he hung up and looked at the room and thought, this is the part where the problem is solved, and the man who solves problems feels satisfied. He did not feel satisfied. He felt the specific raw exhaustion of someone who has just understood, fully and without the protection of partial knowledge, exactly how much damage a year of fear and silence and wrong assumptions can do to something that was, at its foundation, entirely worth protecting. He heard the front door. Elena. He hadn't expected her for another 2 hours, and for a moment he just stayed where he was, listening to the sound of her moving through the entryway, the familiar sounds of her coat going on the hook, her bag set down, her footsteps crossing toward the kitchen and then stopping when she saw the kitchen was empty and then moving toward the living room. She stopped in the doorway. He was sitting on the couch in the middle of the afternoon with nothing in his hands, which was not something she had seen in years. She looked at him. He looked back. It's handled, he said. She nodded slowly. She didn't move from the doorway. Tell me, she said. All of it. He took a breath, and he told her everything. The window in Queens, the folder Marco had brought, the call from Dante, the hotel suite, the shape of what his brother had done, and why he had done it. And when he got to the part where he explained that the provocation, the debt, the entire architecture of threat, had been constructed to force him into learning the truth. Before the divorce papers reached her, he watched her face move through something complicated and unresolvable. When he finished, the room was very quiet. "He did it for you," she said finally. "He did it wrong." "He did it wrong," she agreed. "But he did it for you." Adrian looked at her standing in the doorway. "I'm going to spend a considerable amount of time being angry at him." "That's fair." "After which," he said, "we're probably going to have to figure out what 18 months of silence between brothers actually costs." Elena crossed the room. She sat down next to him on the couch, not across from him, not at the other end, but right next to him, close enough that their arms were touching, and she sat there for a moment, just present in that proximity. And he felt the tension in his chest, the specific coiled tightness that had been living there for months. Begin, slowly, incompletely, with a long way still to go, to loosen. "I should have told you," she said. "I should have been someone you could tell." "Both can be true." "Both are true." She turned her head and looked at him. Her face was tired and clear-eyed and more open than it had been in a year. And he looked at her and she looked at him, and between them was 14 months of wreckage and fear and wrong assumptions and a brother's disastrous good intentions. And underneath all of it, persistent and intact despite everything, was the thing that had been there since a fundraiser 12 years ago when she'd asked him why he'd come. "I need you to be there," she said quietly. "For the treatments, the appointments. I can't do it the way I've been doing it. I know. It's going to be hard. I know. There are going to be days—" She stopped. "There are going to be bad days." "Then we'll have bad days." He held her gaze. "We've been having them alone. We'll have them together. That's different." She looked at him for a moment longer. Then she put her head on his shoulder. He put his arm around her. Outside, the February afternoon moved through its pale light toward evening, and inside the house on the street with the iron fence and the bare oak trees, the most feared man in New York sat on his couch with his wife's weight against him and did not move, and did not manage anything, and did not execute any plan, and stayed exactly where he was as the light changed and the room went slowly dark around them, because this exact thing, was the only place in the world he needed to be. And he had almost, through pride and fear and a year of wrong assumptions, lost it entirely. And he was not, now that he understood that, going to waste a single moment of what remained by being anywhere else. His phone buzzed on the cushion beside him. He reached over without disturbing Elena and turned it face down. The city could wait. 3 days passed before Adrian called his brother back. Not because he needed 3 days to decide what to say. He knew what needed to be said within an hour of leaving that hotel suite, but he needed 3 days to be certain he could say it without the conversation becoming something irreparable, because Dante had a particular talent for receiving anger and converting it into justification, and Adrian needed this to be a reckoning, not a war. In those 3 days, he went with Elena to her appointment with Dr. Kessler. He had not asked her permission. He'd simply said, the morning of the appointment, that he'd be driving her. And she had looked at him across the kitchen with the coffee mug in her hand and not argued, which told him more than any conversation could have about how tired she had been of carrying it alone. Dr. Kessler's office was on the 14th floor of a building on the Upper East Side. Clean, quiet, the kind of medical space designed to communicate competence without triggering the particular dread that harsher environments produced. Adrian sat in the waiting room for 11 minutes while Elena went through preliminary intake, and then a nurse appeared in the doorway and said that Mrs. Voss had asked if her husband could join them, and Adrian stood up before the sentence was finished. The doctor was a lean man in his late 50s, precise in his movements, with the specific economy of someone who had spent decades calibrating exactly how much information to deliver and in what sequence. He shook Adrian's hand with the steady grip of a man who had shaken the hands of a great many frightened people, and understood that the grip itself was data, that how a person received it told you something about where they were, She's progressing, Kessler said. He pulled up the imaging on a mounted screen and walked them through it with the careful thoroughness of a man who believed that informed patients did better than protected ones. The response to the current protocol has been better than we initially modeled. There are still cycles ahead, and I won't minimize the road, but the trend is favorable. Adrian sat in the chair beside Elena's and listened to every word. He did not interrupt. He did not take over. He had a specific list of questions he'd written on his phone the night before, practical, logistical, about the treatment schedule and the things that would make the remaining cycles more manageable and the indicators they'd be watching. And he asked them in order when Kessler finished, and the doctor answered them with the straightforward precision of a man who respected a question that had been thought about before it was asked. When they left, walking back through the lobby toward the car, Elena reached over and took his hand. Just that. He held it, and they walked out into the February cold, and he did not say anything because there was nothing that needed saying. He called Dante on the third evening. Marco drove him to a neutral location, a restaurant in Midtown that Adrian had a quiet arrangement with, a private room in the back that didn't show up in the reservation system, the kind of arrangement that certain establishments in New York maintained with certain clients as a matter of mutually beneficial discretion. He arrived first and sat with a glass of water and waited. Dante arrived 7 minutes later. He looked different than he had in the hotel suite, less composed. The easy quality was still there in the way he moved, but something underneath it had shifted. Some structural confidence had developed a crack, and Adrian saw it and filed it without comment. Dante sat down across from him and they looked at each other. The room was small and quiet. A single lamp on the table, no music. The sound of the restaurant on the other side of the door, muffled and distant. "How is she?" Dante said. "Better than she was? Better than you helped her be." Dante absorbed that. "I deserve that." "You deserve considerably more than that." Adrian's voice was level. "But I'm going to say what needs to be said once, and I'm not going to repeat it, so listen carefully." Dante folded his hands on the table and listened. "You used her," Adrian said. "That's the fact of it, whatever the reasoning was underneath it. You found the most vulnerable thing in my life, and you built an operation around it without her knowledge or consent, and you exposed her, however managed you believed that exposure to be, to a man whose organization uses methods that I don't permit within 100 miles of anyone I care about. You did this for 18 months of silence between us, which was a silence I created, and you decided that gave you the right to intervene in my marriage through a method that could have gone wrong in 15 different ways at any point." He paused. "It didn't go wrong because I found out when I did. That was luck, Dante, not management." Dante was quiet. "If you had come to me," Adrian said, "if you had called me, on any phone through any channel, and told me that my wife was sick and I was about to make the worst mistake of my life, I would have listened. I would have been angry that you'd been watching, but I would have listened." "You hadn't spoken to me in 18 months, Dante said. "I wasn't certain you'd listen to anything I had to say." "Then you should have found out, instead of assuming." Adrian looked at him. "You did exactly what I did with Elena. You decided you knew what someone would do, and you managed around them instead of through them, and you nearly destroyed what you were trying to protect." The silence between them was long. "I know," Dante said, quietly, without justification. "Tell me why you came back," Adrian said. "The real reason, not the part about watching the situation here." Dante looked at the table for a moment, then up. "Because I was tired," he said. 18 months of wherever I was, whatever I was doing, I was tired of it. And because I heard through enough people that things between you and Elena were deteriorating and I couldn't watch it happen from a distance and do nothing." He paused. "You're my brother. I made mistakes in how I handled the separation between us. I know that, but I did not stop being your brother because we stopped speaking." Adrian looked at him. "The method was wrong," Dante said. "I knew it was wrong when I was doing it. I told myself the end justified it, and I believed that. And I still believe the end mattered, but I understand that doesn't absolve the method." He met Adrian's eyes. "I'm telling you I'm sorry." Not for coming back. Not for caring what happened. For the way I chose to act on it. The lamp on the table cast a steady, warm light across the space between them. Adrian picked up his water glass and set it back down. "You're going to stay in the city," he said. It was not a question. "If that's—" "Yes, I'd like to." "Then we're going to rebuild this. Whatever we have left to rebuild. But it goes through the front door from here. No operations, no watching from a distance. No managing situations involving Elena without her direct knowledge and consent." He paused. "Are those terms you can operate under?" Dante looked at him. Something in his expression was not quite relief. Something more complicated than relief. Something that had the quality of a man recognizing that the door he'd knocked on was still, despite everything, open. "Yes," he said. "Then we start there," Adrian said. They sat for another hour. They did not resolve 18 months in that room. That was not a night's work, and both of them understood it, but they covered enough ground to establish that the ground was still there, that it was walkable, that the distance between them, which had felt fixed and categorical, was in fact a thing that had been created by choices and could be undone by different ones. When Adrian left, walking back through the restaurant and out onto the street where Marco was waiting, he felt something he hadn't anticipated feeling after that conversation. Not healed, not finished, not clean, but through, like a man who has walked the full length of something difficult and come out the other side still standing. The Castilla matter required one conversation. Adrian arranged it for the following Monday. A brief meeting in the same restaurant, different room, with Castilla arriving looking like a man who had not slept adequately in several weeks, which was an accurate representation of his situation. He was a compact man in his mid-40s with careful eyes and the kind of grooming that telegraphed effort, and he sat across from Adrian with his hands on the table in the deliberate open posture of someone communicating that he was not reaching for anything. "The debt is retired," Adrian said. "You're clear of it." Castilla nodded. "I want you to know that when I understood whose—" "I know," Adrian said. "Dante told me the timeline. I know when you found out and what you did afterward." He looked at the man across from him. "The Hoboken route." "I was trying to open a dialogue," Castilla said. I didn't have a way to approach you directly about it without making it seem like I was threatening. You were in an impossible position." "Yes." "You were put there by my brother." "Yes." Adrian looked at him for a moment. "The territorial situation in Hoboken needs to be formalized. Your people have been operating in margins that haven't been agreed upon. That gets addressed through proper negotiation, not provocation. If you want a conversation about revised boundaries, you come to Marco and you make the request through channels. That's how it works." "Understood. And we don't speak about Elena. Not to your people, not to anyone. Her name, her situation, all of it, it disappears, permanently." "It's already gone," Castilla said. And he meant it. Adrian could read the specific register of a man telling the truth because the alternative was unacceptable to him. "You have my word on that." "Your word and my clear understanding of the consequences if it surfaces," Adrian said. "Both of those things are true simultaneously." "Both of those things are true," Castilla agreed. They shook hands. Castilla left. Adrian sat alone in the room for a few minutes afterward. He thought about the specific texture of the past 3 weeks. The folder on the counter, Dante's voice on a phone that should not have existed, Elena's face when he'd said, "I know," the hotel suite, the restaurant, the morning at Kessler's office with Elena's hand in his on the walk back to the car. He thought about the divorce papers. He had retrieved the envelope from the glove compartment of his car the day after coming home from Queens. He'd held it for a moment in the driveway, in the cold, and then he'd taken it inside and stood over the kitchen sink and burned it. It was not a dramatic gesture. He'd used a lighter from the kitchen drawer and he'd held the envelope by the corner and watched it go. And the whole thing took less than a minute. And he'd washed the ash down the drain and put the lighter back in the drawer. He hadn't told Elena. She didn't need to know it had existed. March came slowly. The treatment cycles continued. Every 3rd week, a full day at the Meridian Clinic, which was no longer the Meridian Clinic in Adrian's mind, but simply the place they went on those Tuesdays, him and Elena, him driving and Elena in the passenger seat with her hand resting on the center console where he could reach it. The sessions themselves were long and medically tedious and occasionally frightening, and he sat through every one of them in the chair beside her infusion chair with the specific patient stillness he had taught himself in those first weeks. He was not good at it immediately. He would be honest about that. The first session he had come in carrying the particular coiled readiness of a man who responds to problems by solving them, and there was nothing to solve, and the not solving was an active effort that required more discipline than anything in his professional life had required in years. He had wanted to talk to the nurses about optimizing the protocol. He had wanted to review Kessler's research publications to evaluate the evidence base for the current approach. He had wanted to do something. Elena had looked at him, after about 40 minutes of this, had looked at the quality of his sitting still, which was not actually still, and she'd said quietly, "You can just be here. You don't have to fix it. Just be here." He had been here. He had gotten better at it. By the third session, he could sit for 3 hours without the restless, productive energy breaking through, and Elena would sometimes sleep during the longer parts of the infusion, and he would sit in the chair and read or simply watch the room and be present in it without the need to act. It was the hardest thing he'd learned in years. He was beginning to understand, the most important. The bad days came in April. Kessler had warned them. The word he'd used was challenging, which was a physician's precision-calibrated word for something that looked from the inside like the treatment occasionally becoming worse than the disease. Elena spent 4 days in the second week of April barely able to move, not from the illness, but from the body's response to what was fighting it. She lay in the bed upstairs in their room, with the curtains mostly drawn, and the nausea moving through her in waves, and Adrian sat in the chair he'd moved to the bedside, and he did not leave. Marco ran the organization. Marco was good at running the organization. On the second day, Elena looked at him from the bed with the gray, exhausted face of someone whose body was fighting a battle she had no conscious access to, and said, "You should go to the office. There's nothing you can do." "I'm not going to the office," he said. "Adrian, there is something I can do," he said. "I can be here." He held her gaze. "You told me to just be here. I'm being here." She looked at him for a moment. "You're getting better at it," she said. "I have a good teacher." Something moved in her face. Not quite a smile, but its ancestor. He got her water. He adjusted the curtains when the light changed. He sat in the chair and read, and when she slept, he watched her breathe with the specific attention of a man who has nearly lost something and has no intention of taking its presence for granted. Rosa came on the third day. She arrived in the mid-morning with containers of food and the brisk, controlled manner of a woman channeling fear into action, and she came into the kitchen and looked at Adrian and said, "You look like you haven't slept." "I've slept." "When?" He considered. "Recently." Rosa looked at him for a moment with those dark, efficient eyes. "Sit down," she said. "I'll make coffee." He sat. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table together. Not a conversation he would have predicted 6 months ago. Rosa and Adrian Voss at the kitchen table in the mid-morning quiet while Elena slept upstairs. And she looked at him across the rim of her mug and said, "She's been protecting you from this for over a year." "I know." "She was wrong to do that," Rosa said. "I told her so, many times." "I know that too. And you were wrong to become someone she felt she had to protect." Rosa set her mug down. "I say that to you because you're sitting at my daughter's kitchen table, and you look like a man who is trying to do right by her, and I have decided to accept that this is what you are now, and so I'm going to speak to you honestly." Adrian looked at her. "Go ahead." "She loves you in a way that costs her things," Rosa said. "That's not a complaint. That's what love does. It asks you to pay things. The question is whether what you give back is worth what she pays." She held his gaze with the steady frankness of a woman who had spent 30 years in a house in Queens, navigating life without excess, and had developed through that navigation a precision about what mattered and what didn't. For the past year, it wasn't. You were both paying, and neither of you was giving. "Yes," he said. "Is that different now?" He thought about Elena's hand on his arm in the sitting room, the appointment with Kessler, the chair by the infusion bed, the envelope burning in the kitchen sink. "It's different now," he said. Rosa looked at him for a long moment. "Good," she said, and picked up her mug. And that was the end of it. No performance, no extended deliberation, just a woman updating her position based on available evidence and moving forward. He understood why Elena was the way she was. But May arrived with warmth. The final treatment cycle completed on a Thursday in the second week of May, and Kessler met with them the following Monday with the results of the post-cycle imaging and the blood work and the panel of indicators he'd been tracking since the beginning. He went through everything with the same careful thoroughness he'd used from the first appointment, and Adrian sat in the same chair beside Elena and listened with the same full attention he'd brought to every session. The results were good. Not finished. Kessler was precise about that. Used words like sustained response and monitoring protocol and 6-month intervals that made clear this was not an ending so much as a transition, but good. Better than the initial modeling, better than the revised projections from February. Elena sat very still while Kessler talked. When he finished, she asked 3 questions: practical, specific, about the monitoring schedule, and what they were watching for and what the triggers would be for reconsidering the protocol. She asked them in the calm, clear voice of a woman who had spent 14 months becoming fluent in a language she'd never wanted to learn, and Kessler answered each one with the precision it deserved. When they left, walking back through the lobby toward the car, the May air was warm in a way that February had seemed constitutionally incapable of producing, and the trees on the Upper East Side were in full leaf, green and specific. And Elena stopped on the sidewalk outside the building and tilted her face up toward the sky for a moment and stood there. Adrian stopped beside her. He didn't say anything. After a moment, she brought her face back down and looked at him, and her eyes were wet, but nothing had fallen, and she said, "I want to go somewhere. Not home. Somewhere. Can we just drive for a while?" "Yes," he said. They drove north out of the city, through the upper Manhattan neighborhoods and into Westchester, and the green deepened on either side of the highway, and Elena sat in the passenger seat with her window cracked and her hand resting on the center console, and Adrian drove with one hand on the wheel and his other hand over hers, and neither of them spoke for the first hour. And the silence was the right kind, the kind that doesn't need filling. They stopped at a roadside place that was barely a restaurant. 6 tables, a hand-lettered menu on a chalkboard, coffee that came in ceramic mugs without handles. And they sat across from each other at a table by the window with the afternoon light moving across it, and Elena ordered eggs and toast and ate all of it, slowly, with the focused pleasure of someone whose appetite has returned after a long absence, and Adrian watched her eat and drank his coffee and didn't say anything about how long it had been since he'd watched her eat a whole meal without the careful performance of normalcy around it. "I want to tell you something," Elena said when she'd finished. "Okay." "I don't regret protecting you." She held his gaze. "I want you to know that. I know it caused damage. I know it let things go wrong between us that didn't have to go wrong. I know all of that. And I would have done the same thing, because I know how you are, and I know what it would have done to you, and I love you enough to have taken that on myself." She paused. "What I regret is not finding a way that didn't require lying to you. I think I could have found a way. I don't think I tried hard enough to find it because I was scared, and I let my fear do the choosing, and that wasn't fair to either of us." He looked at her across the table. "I should have been someone you weren't scared to tell," he said. "You should have," she agreed, "and you're working on that." She said it plainly, without accusation. "I see you working on it. Is it visible?" "Very." A pause. "The chair by the bed. That's the minimum." "It's not the minimum. Don't do that." Her voice was quiet, but it had an edge to it that was not unkind. "Don't minimize what you've actually done by measuring it against some standard nobody could reach. You've been there. You've shown up every time. That's not nothing." He was quiet. "It's not nothing to me," she said. He looked at her in the afternoon light in the roadside place with the ceramic mugs and the hand-lettered menu, and he thought about the fundraiser 12 years ago and the way she'd looked at him without calculating anything. And he thought about how completely he had failed in the intervening years to be consistently worthy of that look. And he thought about the specific fact that she was still here, that she had stayed through a year of increasing distance and his fear masquerading as composure, that she had stayed through illness and silence and an almost divorce she didn't know about, and that she was sitting here now ordering eggs and telling him she saw him trying. "I'm going to keep working on it," he said. "I know you are." She picked up her coffee mug with both hands. "I'm going to keep working on things too. The silence, the protecting. I'm going to learn to let you in when it's hard. That might take a while. Probably. I'll wait," he said. She looked at him. "I'm not going anywhere," he said. Summer arrived. The garden behind the mansion, the walled garden with the old stone path and the rose beds that Elena had planted in their second year and tended with the particular patient attention she brought to things she loved, came into itself the way it did every year, with a slowness that rewarded watching. Adrian watched it more than he had before. He was in the office less. Not dramatically, not in a way that created operational problems. The organization ran the way it ran, and Marco had grown into his expanded responsibilities with the quiet competence of a man who had been ready for them for years, but measurably. He came home at 7 instead of 10. He ate dinner at the table instead of at his desk. On Sunday mornings, he was in the kitchen when Elena was in the kitchen, and they occupied the space together with the ease of people who have stopped performing ease and simply arrived at it. Dante came for dinner in June. It was Elena's idea, which was either a sign of her generosity or her stubbornness or both, which were qualities that had always overlapped in her. She had listened to what Dante had done with the specific clear-eyed fairness she brought to everything, and she had sat with it, and she had arrived at a position that was neither forgiveness nor its absence, but something more complicated and more honest than either. "He was wrong," she said, when she told Adrian she'd like to invite him, "and he did it for you. Those two things can both be real." The dinner was careful and not without tension. Dante arrived with a bottle of wine that was an apology in beverage form, and he stood in the kitchen doorway looking at Elena with the expression of a man who knows he owes someone something he cannot adequately pay, and Elena looked back at him with the steady, direct gaze she used when she was choosing what to do with information she'd fully processed. "Come in," she said. "I made lamb." He came in. The dinner was 2 hours. By the end of it, not everything was resolved. These things don't resolve in a dinner, and all three of them understood that. But the framework for resolution was there. The door was open. The light was on inside. After Dante left, Elena washed the dishes, and Adrian dried them, and they stood at the kitchen sink in the summer evening, and the window above the sink was open, and the air coming through it was warm and carried the smell of the garden. "Thank you," Adrian said. She handed him a bowl to dry. "He's your brother. He made your life harder than it needed to be. He also, in a broken and entirely backwards way, made sure you found out before you handed me divorce papers." She was quiet for a moment. "I'm not saying he was right. I'm saying the full picture is complicated, and I'm capable of holding complicated pictures." He dried the bowl. "You're a better person than most," he said. "I'm a tired person who decided that managing grudges takes energy I don't have." She handed him a glass. "That's less noble than it sounds." He dried the glass. They finished the dishes. The garden in July. He found her there on a Saturday morning, moving along the stone path between the rose beds with a pair of clippers and the focused expression she wore when she was doing something she liked well enough not to think about anything else simultaneously. The roses were at their height, deep reds and the pale yellows she'd added 3 years ago, and one climbing variety against the south wall that had become, over 7 years, an entire architecture of growth. He came out and sat on the bench at the path's edge. She worked and he sat, and the morning moved through its early light, and the garden was very quiet except for the specific industry of bees in the roses and the distant sound of the city beyond the walls. After a while, she came and sat beside him. They sat looking at the garden. "Kessler called yesterday," she said. "The 6-week markers are good." "I know. He called me too." She looked at him sideways. "He called you?" "I asked him to keep both of us updated." She was quiet for a moment. "When did you do that?" "March, after the first appointment." She looked at the garden. Something in her expression shifted, settled. "I didn't know that," she said. "I know you didn't. You've been getting updates for 3 months. Yes? And you didn't tell me you were getting them. I didn't want you to feel monitored. I wanted the information for myself. He paused. Was that wrong? She thought about it, genuinely thought about it, in the way she thought about things. Not performing deliberation, but actually running it. No, she said. That's you taking care of yourself in this situation. That's not wrong. He nodded. They sat. I keep thinking about the last year, she said after a while. About how much of it was both of us doing things we thought were right, and both of us being wrong about what right looked like. She clipped a dead head from the rows nearest the bench, a precise small movement. We were so careful of each other. We were so careful that we stopped being honest, and then the care was just distance with better intentions. Yes, he said. I don't want to do that again. Neither do I. She looked at him. So we don't. So we don't, he agreed. She put the clippers down on the bench between them and leaned back and looked at the roses, and he leaned back beside her, and they sat in the July garden with the morning around them and the bees in the roses and the city on the other side of the wall, and he looked at her profile in the light, and he thought about all the things that had almost happened, all the alternative versions of this year that were still there somewhere in the space of what might have been. The divorce papers reaching her. Elena alone in a clinic chair. Castilla with his leverage and his careful calculations. Dante watching from a distance with his good intentions and his terrible method. And he thought about the specific, improbable fact that they were here anyway. Not because the year had been easy, not because anyone had made the right choices at every turn, but because when it mattered, when the moment came that required something actual, they had both found their way back to the same place. He reached over and took her hand. She turned her palm up and held his. They stayed there for a long time in the garden while the morning moved around them, unhurried, in the full and ordinary light of a day that did not require anything extraordinary from either of them. Only this. Only presence. Only the quiet practice of being in the same place at the same time, without armor or management or the particular loneliness of two people who love each other and have forgotten how to say so. The roses held their color against the July light. The garden held its silence. And inside the walls of a life they had nearly lost and had chosen, imperfectly and at considerable cost, to keep, they held each other. That was all. That was enough.